Live from Nasrec, south of Johannesburg. Welcome to this special edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight,
security kanisondele hapa Santella. Security, please come here. Continue, President.
Day one of the much anticipated ANC conference. We look at the highs and lows, the drama, but we also get into Cyril Ramaphosa's political report. All that and more coming up in tonight's show, which starts right now.
Thank you. Thank you, comrades. Thank you. Let us now start. As well as our observers and guests for your attendance to this 55th National Conference of the African National Congress. A special word of welcome to representatives of fellow liberation movements and sister parties who honor us through their presence here.
Security kanisondele hapa Santella. Security, please come here. Continue, President. Continue, President. Security, come. Security kanisondele hapa Santella. Security, please come here. Continue, President.
A bit of the drama and chaos that marked the start of today's proceedings. As you saw there, President Cyril Ramaphosa's political report being disrupted by people who were chanting some negative things, some of them about him. We're going to look at that, but also, of course, we're going to look into his entire speech and, of course, throw forward to what's going to be happening over the next 4 days or so. And to help me do that, I do have here in our makeshift studio Angela Fick and Professor Susan Boyce. And good evening to both of you. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening.
Good evening.
What a start to the day's proceedings, 8 or so hours later.
Yes, it was indeed interesting, in a way exciting, in the way that there were about 8 hours of nothing before that, and still apparently the designated delegates are being registered. And that's probably a reason why proceedings are now suspended. But yes, I say it is not that exciting because that is in many ways how ANC does conferences. There are disruptions, there are from the floor, dissent from the floor. It was quite exceptional in middle of this year at the ANC's policy conference, how controlled it was, how there were almost no disruptions. But yes, that's the way delegates do things. But this one is in many ways also more complex because it comes in combination with a particular type of very intense legal contestations. It comes along with contestation of the way the candidate list for the NEC elections was constructed. So it's different types of challenges, and yes, Probably not the majority of delegates on the conference floor this afternoon, although there were also many, many open seats. But they were vocal, and there was no idea that they got home the message of what they opposed, that they blame Ramaphosa for Pala, obviously for Pala, and for load shedding. There was quite a common chant from the floor as well.
Well, I mean, Prof is right in that, I mean, every elective conference has this kind of drama. But I dare say not to the extent we've seen today here at this particular conference.
So I think in addition to the logistical challenges and the legal issues and the disciplinary issues and the party's organizational troubles, partly this was a public relations and embarrassment moment. This was a public relations fail. So not only did you have members of the invited international diplomatic corps present at 8:30 this morning, who then had to wait with everybody else the 8 hours, but you also had these attempts to spin out the time. So you had an incredibly long address to the media, which was actually addressed through the media to members of the ANC from Pulemabe in the media center, covering everything from drones through to alcohol consumption, drug abuse, and good behavior. To this
moments from that
precisely
briefing.
But I think it speaks something to how the ANC went into this moment with unfinished business more than it usually does. And that, I think, is the difficulty for an African National Congress under Mr. Ramaphosa that signals it wants to be better than its predecessor under Jacob Zuma. And that's, I think, tough times for a party to face, that at the end of its first day, only one piece of business on the agenda was actually completed.
Well, Cyril Ramaphosa says, if anything, this is about renewal of the ANC, to rid the ANC of undesirable elements and to focus on its original mission. Did that come through in a speech?
Well, barely, I would say. It was a speech that was, to a large extent, focused on routine government business, on progress with this and progress with that and setbacks on that, etc. So that, for me, was the main thrust of his speech. And it's not unusual for Ramaphosa to deliver that kind of speech. We have heard those speeches before. It certainly succeeded in dousing all enthusiasm for robust engagement from the floor. It was really, very core, boring state business. And I say boring very respectfully, only in a sense that there was nothing that we had not heard before. It was a government report.
In fact, I got a sense at some point that it could have, I mean, the whole speech could have been cut in half. You know, I mean, he would have said everything he wanted to say in half the time,
yes,
or the pages that he,
Yes, and so to be fair, the message of renewal, rejuvenating the ANC, that did come through here and there, but no, that should have been the passionate center of the speech like that. But then that was probably not, because he cannot deliver that with the credibility that he deserves, because there are too many people in his own camp and too many hanging questions, lingering questions about Pala to make him the clear-cut, pristine candidate. So it is very much, it is a conference, uncomfortable, in some ways almost a sad conference, but it is a very good sketch of the condition of the ANC at this stage.
Before you come in, Angelo, let's take a listen to a bit of what he had to say around renewal.
Our experience of recent years is that disunity does not arise from ideological, political, or strategic differences amongst us, but it arises from a contest over positions in the state and resources that are attached to them. That is what causes disunity amongst us. We need to acknowledge that despite our efforts over the last 5 years, we are not as united, we are not as cohesive or effective as we should be. Now, our disunity continues at the expense of the support that we should get from the people of South Africa. Because when our people see us disunited, they walk away from us. They only gravitate towards the ANC when they see that its leadership is united, its membership is united and cohesive, its leadership is not at each other's throats, its leadership does not continue to attack each other on public platforms.
Is he correct in his analysis of what brings about disunity within the ANC?
I think his analysis of what makes the party, disunited, there's some merit to that. I don't think that the reason people do not gravitate to the ANC is only because they were not united. There are other things that ANC deployees in government from municipal through to national level have done and have been implicated in that may also be driving people away. And if the ANC had been unified and had done these things, I don't think those people would have stuck with the ANC. Because if you have maladministration, wasteful expenditure, corruption, municipalities in disarray, it doesn't matter how unified the party is in your perception. If your daily experience is lack of safety, lack of water, lack of energy, lack of life chances for your children because of a compromised education system and economy, you don't care how united these people appear. The other thing that I thought was interesting was this was a direct, broad, sort of attack on Lindiwe Sisulu, who has spoken out against him from inside his own cabinet. The switch there to Mr. Zuma at the end is again a moment that we've had people from the party speak out against, and also to the statements from people like Supra Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Supra Mohamapelo, and Ace Magashule outside the conference today. So I think that there is some way in which the people who wrote the speech for the president and for him to deliver are maneuvering ahead of whatever they imagine the election outcome to be is going to deliver. And, I think Susan is right. This was not the moment in which to have that strong core message, but it'll be interesting to see if he does get re-elected as president, what his closing remarks as president will be and how that compares to today's speech and whether it's stronger, punchier, less prolix, less verbose, and actually delivers a punch directly rather than the skirmishing and dancing in the ring around opponents, which he can't afford just before an election.
Here's what he had to say, Prof, about divisions within the party.
Some of the divisions that existed before the 54th National Conference continue within the organization. They also continue within the leadership core of the ANC. Members of the ANC often tell me that, President, we as members are united. It is you, the leaders of the ANC, who are divided. But they also tell me that, President, it is you, the leadership, who cause divisions amongst us as members of the ANC. Now, as we anticipated, the actions we were mandated to take against corruption and state capture have at times caused friction amongst us. So the process of renewal of the ANC, comrades, was given a really good boost when the proposal of the ANC Veterans League was accepted by the NEC to set up a renewal commission, which will present its report during this conference.
Prof? Are the divisions within or among the ANC's leaders the reason the membership is behaving the way it does?
Yes and no. Now, certainly the divisions are so entrenched and people really relate to the grounds for those divisions. And because the divisions are largely centered around access to resources, leaders' access to the resources. And that goes quite deep down. Yes, the leaders really run with that and benefit from that big time. But when it gets on the ground, so many people who join the ANC because they aspire to that. They think the ANC can make this possible.
Exactly.
And that is then again the character of the ANC at this particular conjuncture that we're in. It is just not able at this stage to give the principled, ethical leadership that is so required. And it would be fascinating to see if the Renewal Commission actually finds answers to that type of problem.
Yeah, because, I mean, look at local government. It's about who's the most powerful guy in the room. Then he gets to be nominated, whether he has the capacity or the ability to do the job at council or in the provincial legislature is neither here nor there. He gets sorted on the basis of what he brings to the party for the leader or their faction.
And of course he comes in with, or she comes in with patronage networks, and so it's dispersing. It's the one place in which trickle-down economics is actually being implemented, because all sorts of people don't have access to all sorts of opportunities, and not just of the mega contracts kind, but of the very simple kind. You don't get the cleaning job if you're not the person who knows the person who is going to be nominated and so support that person. And here I think the patronage network issue is often disguised as, well, cadre deployment is important because there's an ideological project. But if the president says part of the conflict isn't about ideology, it isn't about political and strategy systems, it's about control over resources and access to resources, one has to wonder what that contradiction is between defending cadre deployment and suggesting that the fights aren't about ideology.
And this is, true for the comrades at local level that we don't know about, all the way to, the top 6 officials. Because, at local government, it could be the difference between having a job, and staying at home and not being able to feed your family. And right at the top, you look at some of the officials, it's been the difference between staying alive, staying out of jail, and going to prison.
Yes. Diverse motivations there, and more complicated one at the top level very often. But you're absolutely right, both of you. At that local level, I spend do a lot of research on local government, and those factions they're not featured that strongly. It is straight about contracts, procurement, who gets what. They may note this person is aligned to this faction or that faction, but it does not go into it doesn't determine the outcomes of those local government decisions. So it's really fused with the fiber of the party.
I've got to go back, Angela, to something you mentioned, the swap that he at some point took at Lindiwe Sisulu. And as I was listening to, in fact, let's listen to what he said around populism. I'm sure your guess will be as good as mine as to who he was referring to or what he was referring to there.
More than 50% of our budget goes towards the social wage to support the livelihoods of our people. This does not obtain in many other countries around the world. The positive momentum of economic reform program was severely disrupted by the measures we had to take to address the pandemic. As the pandemic subsided, the Russia-Ukraine conflict disrupted global logistics and supply chains, causing severe shortages of critical commodities such as oil, grain, and amongst other things. The unrest that we went through also contributed to our economic woes. Inflation has soared, necessitating the tightening of monetary policy with all the negative consequences for the economy and on our people. The sound macroeconomic reform agenda that we are diligently executing, as well as the strengthening of SARS and the gains that it is making in tax revenue, occasioned by positive terms of trade, should give us confidence that our fiscal position is set to return to a firmer footing over the medium term.
Well, not quite the clip I actually wanted to play. It was the one I wanted to play was talking about how ANC cadres should resist the temptation, to whip people's emotions, and make statements that actually undermine our own constitution and the laws of the country. Hopefully we'll get to that. But let's go where he was just now, where he was trying to explain the reason the ANC hasn't done well in creating jobs, addressing the issue of unemployment, economic growth, and putting a great deal of the blame on the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but also, what is happening currently in the Russia war against Ukraine, and so on. But I got a sense, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, here, Angela, I got a sense that there wasn't enough by way of going all the way back, because you're talking here about things that have happened over the past couple of years, yet we're talking about 28 years of ANC government. So you didn't have that penetrating analysis about what brought us to the situation we were in before COVID.
Well, this is a feature of undergraduate essay writing, where people choose bits and pieces of evidence that supports the argument that they have, and they simply ignore the other evidence that screams that must be included to complexify the analysis. So yes, we have had severe challenges over the last 2 years that include the items that he's mentioned. But that does not address, as you've pointed out, economic planning and other forms of policy that were not implemented. Let us not forget, it was the Minister of Communication that delayed the digital migration, which was both party policy as well as government policy. And that set us back in terms of development by a whole sort of decade.
Oh, well, what was interesting, though, Andrew, is that when he started talking about some of the things that they've done recently to deal with this, he went back to the fact that, look at the spectrum issue now, we're moving.
But we're moving late. It's a bit like suggesting the engine stalled. We switched off the engine and, oh, don't worry, we're now restarting. And we all have been in taxis, well, some of us have been in taxis that do exactly this thing. You think you're going to get from Umgungundlovu to eThekwini in a certain amount of time, but then the taxi stalls and then the driver speeds up to get you there on time, and additional risks are built into the journey. And my question here is, again, if the president suggests that we're now back on track, we're not back on track. We're lagging, and we're not just lagging internally, we're lagging in terms of where the global development goals are. And this is, again, my critique of policies that get implemented late. You can't implement a policy from 10 years ago, 10 years later, and assume you're going to get the same outcome. You do have to adjust the policy with the new conditions that you're now sitting with. We're in a post-pandemic world, and so the need to go in the digital direction is now far more urgent, because all sorts of new information is in place. The need to have scientifically literate citizens is far more urgent now, because you do want people to understand vaccination, medicine, health concerns in a complex, modern way, so that you don't have, as new pandemics emerge over the next half century, a population that repeats the mistakes that we had between 2020 and 2022.
What is your take, Prof, on the apparent reluctance to give a penetrating analysis, to look back properly, at what's happened over the past 28? Is it because there is not knowledge, skills of people who can actually do that, or is it because don't touch that because we're going to be exposed?
I think a large part of this is lack of accountability and lack of top executive people being held to account. Cabinet members sit there pretty secure that their jobs are going to be maintained and safe, irrespective of whether they move fast or not, irrespective of whether there are irregularities in their departments or not. And there are so many aspects where much faster action was possible, definitely, but the president was not pushing. probably because he did not want to be pushed himself in return, and probably because his cabinet was such a compromise. The appointment of the people from different factions post Nasrec won 5 years ago, and people were just safely in their positions, not fearing reshuffling at all, or hardly at all, except in one or two cases where people like Zweli Mkhize had to step down, etc., Malusi Gigaba. But overall, accountability was so low, and there's really a lot to be that he is accountable for. I also think Sir Ramaphosa was fortunate in that he's got the Ukrainian war and the pandemic to blame. Jacob Zuma got the 2008 global recession that he could blame. So is any president ever going to accept full accountability? We hope the next president will.
But as the interesting, there was a time when we couldn't sit and have conversations about things that are happening in our country because ministers, directors general and other senior public servants wouldn't want to come and talk about their work. But an interesting thing happened over the years where we would have conversations like these without them, where a lot of think tanks started forming, and then we could have conversations as a nation without the people who are supposedly in charge or whom we have given the right to govern us. And I think over time that has come back to bite the ANC in the sense that you now have a South Africa that in many people are a lot wiser. They know more and they speak their minds, in ways that we haven't seen, before. And I think that has become one source of embarrassment, as a result of which you have ministers or the government generally not coming forward.
So I think there are two things that I think in response to that. The first is that the ANC and Mr. Ramaphosa and his predecessors have the same problem that South Africans have had for a very long time. A very complicated myth-making relationship to our own histories. We don't like to delve deep. And so when people look back to apartheid South Africa, beneficiaries and victims alike have a very sanitizing view of what that was. We have public officials, people elected to the highest offices at provincial level, wanting to reinvent colonialism and what that means and what its textured experience was. And so to me, it's not surprising that the ANC doesn't really want to undo and look at what has happened over the last 28 years under its governance, because that would be very self-disconcerting. It would cause it to have an existential crisis. But in that sense, it's very much like middle-class South Africa. It too doesn't want to look at how it has been implicated in and complicit with the making of this unequal society. The second thing, I think, is also that the ANC, in constructing a constitutional democracy with a public broadcaster, with access to information and all sorts of freedoms, continues to operate like a liberation movement in which secrecy, control over information has to be guarded. And don't understand what the consequences of living in an environment that you've created in which accountability takes a new meaning in a constitutional democracy with institutions through which you have to be accountable. And I think that that conflict has meant that it has been surprised by the consequences of its actions. And that speaks itself in just on Tuesday, where it constructs the rules and then it's surprised that it has to implement them. It is around the party political funding formula. It agrees to the rules and then it gets burnt and says, oh, oops, no, we didn't want this as an outcome. Now we have a financial crisis. And in the same way, I think in looking back at how these people are defensive when they come forward, you're only defensive if you cannot explain why the actions that you were expected to perform haven't been performed. Otherwise, you would explain very clearly, these have been our difficulties, but this is how we implemented it. And the fact that official after official over the last 28 years hasn't been able to do it goes all the way back to the Mandela cabinet. Let's not forget, when he was questioned around his foreign policy in relation to Indonesia, his response was defensive and says, this is our foreign policy, this is what the ANC does, I'm not explaining this any further. Where was the human rights record? Where was we're going to have a new kind of human rights-centered ethos in our foreign policy? None of that there.
If you just joined us, we're looking at day one of the ANC's elective conference. And of course, our departure point for our conversation is President Cyril Ramaphosa's political report, which he delivered this afternoon. This conversation continues right after this. welcome back. We are live from Nasrec, the south of Johannesburg, and that's where the ANC conference, the ANC conference is taking place. Day one of that conference, which was delayed by about 8 hours, is what we are focusing on. The only really item that was on the agenda, or that they could go through today, was President Cyril Ramaphosa's political report, and it's the basis which we are having this conversation. Now, I was saying earlier that there was something I found very interesting. Right, almost, it wasn't even halfway, maybe. Through the speech, where he started talking about the need to protect the Constitution and not exploit it, because you are canvassing for a position, or you want to sound more revolutionary, as my reading of it, than the other people. Let's go back to that clip.
We should resist the populist retort that seeks to lay the blame for lack of transformation and poor service delivery on the constitutional protections and safeguards that ultimately protects us and future generations. We should rather develop and implement policies that will manifest the promise of a transformative constitution that we have. Improving our performance stands at the center of what we have described as the second phase of transition to a national democratic society.
Any guess who he was referring to? Or what he was referring to?
Yes. There is certainly this recognized to be quite an element of populism in a rhetoric, and some of the actions, more rhetoric than actions, of people associated with so-called radical economic transformation. I say so-called because there's very often more rhetoric rather than action. When I have the opportunities to act, there is just no action. We just think of land, and Cyril Ramaphosa was also really trying to emphasize the radical in his own policies today. He was going on the land, he was going about unequitability on quite a few fronts. He was Chris Hani against Janus Valus. He was going against the decisions to have him released. So there was quite an element of populism in his speech as well. But yes, we know recently there's been quite a few cases where constitutionalism, the constitutionality of court rulings, etc., where those are questioned and held, regarded as against full transformation. And yes, I can understand that he cautions against it. But then I think the ANC should really also look in itself for some of the causes for that. And that is really when you see the shortcomings of multi-party democracy and how it's been operating in South Africa. Political parties, how they're really disappointing, how they really often simply have not been taking forward those promises of equality and equitability and second, third, fourth generation human rights that are built into the Constitution. But we know it often means even the right to housing, the right to land, etc. Those are just not given effect. And so the ANC, as the government of the last 28 years, should really take a lot of blame if there are attacks on constitutionality and constitutionalism and much more support for populism.
In fact, some of those attacks have come from some of the people who are keen to lead the ANC as we speak.
And also that they at the moment serve in the cabinet run by the man who we were told a few years ago has the right to appoint and disappoint. So if you have the right to appoint and disappoint, and a member of the cabinet that you supposedly appoint,
your prerogative.
Your prerogative is to hire and fire people. If they are, one, defying you, and two, suggesting that the Constitution that they took an oath of office as a member of Parliament to uphold and protect, what is your duty then, as the man who appoints and disappoints, to discipline that member of your cabinet? how is it that you deal with this to signal to the ordinary public that the executive administration of the Republic of South Africa respects the Constitution? What discipline do you kick in to the members of your cabinet who are supposedly accountable to you? Or is it actually that you can't do that because you're accountable to the NEC, where that person serves and has a sizable support? And in that sense, the question that ordinary South Africans would then have is, who really appoints cabinet? Who really administers the executive arm? And how will we then hold that executive arm accountable through a parliamentary process that can so easily be compromised by the same structure instructing the members of parliament to vote in a particular way, regardless of what it is that their oath of office requires of them, which is, after all, the Mogoeng judgment on the conflict between loyalty to party, which could get you fired, and loyalty to the Constitution, which should come first, and thereby electoral reform is required.
And it's not something confined to matters of the executive, what the president does or doesn't do. Taking it to the party, I mean, we're coming to this conference, the ANC having taken resolutions about women representation in structures of the party, in government, everywhere, basically you go. And the way he put it in his speech was quite interesting, and it wasn't you couldn't miss the contradictions also in what he was saying. Just take a listen to what he had to say around that.
Women need to participate fully and equally within all structures of the ANC, and all South Africans, regardless of race, gender, class, language, culture, sexual orientation, or disability, must find a home in the African National Congress.
From the last status briefing by Kgalema Motlanthe and his electoral committee, looks like only one woman is going to make it to the top 6.
Yes, indeed.
So the iron was not lost.
Yes, 2 candidates, but for the same position. Yes, indeed. Of course, there's a small possibility that other candidates may be nominated from the floor, but it's a small possibility. And yes, the ANC really has to look at itself here, and the opportunities, empowerment that's created. It's not a once every 5 years occasion when you lament that there are not enough women in certain positions, if they have not been given more opportunities. But I think women are also to blame to some extent, where they now don't grab those opportunities, they don't mobilize, organize, ensure that they have those kind of political support bases, that they don't play politics away. Politics is a hard game, and they're not going to get positions. And if they get positions because they're women, or because they're young people, or because they are some classes and not other classes, for example, that is not going to make them good politicians. So women really ANC needs to look at itself, but women also need to look at themselves. And of course, and then the convergence of the two is so tangible. The ANC Women's League seriously need to take 10 looks at itself, because they have not been playing into that space where so many opportunities have been created, and still they lack credible candidates when it comes to the final competitions.
And it's not just women. I mean, look at the youth, for example. I mean, they have a resolution actually on youth, but where is that being implemented? Do they lobby? Do they use, their own agency to see to it that their own resolutions are implemented? I mean, they're coming to this conference with resolutions that have been piling up, but none of them really being implemented.
But if the mother body does not capacitate the leagues, what do you expect? And if you decapacitate the leagues over a period of time, let's not forget what has happened to the Youth League after 2012.
In fact, none of the leagues are actually functioning.
Yes.
They all have task teams.
Yes.
Right. What you then sit with is that the structures that are supposed to transform, not just in terms of visibility, but the very processes by which the mother body works. that the whole point of Shalom Haklek's letters way back was not just about getting women present in organization, it was about changing the way in which organization happens. And in a femicidal country, where women are equal on paper, there's very little feminist impulse in what it is that we hear and see in the ANC's public presentation. There's a lot of masculine posturing, there's a lot of patriarchal work going on, there's a lot of kind of rhetoric that borders on the violence when it doesn't actually spill over into it, and one wants to ask what has happened to that transformational project of defanging the violence out of our political rhetoric and making sure that this is a space which does not echo and repeat the very problems that mar the society around its view of women. Because we can pretend South Africa is not deeply misogynistic, but the statistics of how we treat women and those we gender as feminine, how they are treated, tells us that we're a deeply misogynistic society, and that the governing party, which supposedly has one of the strongest women's organizations in it, cannot produce one candidate beyond the same candidate. Because let's not forget, this Deputy Secretary General position was held by the one woman in the last administration. Are we repeating that? And what does it mean for young women in this country that there will not be a woman president visible within the end of this decade?
Racism, Prof, is also another issue. I mean, he highlighted this as something to really look at with our eyes, or the ANC faithful's eyes, being a little more open, put a lot of focus, because after all, talking about taking the ANC back to what its founders wanted to achieve, it's something that has been lost along the way. And it's a subject, I mean, increasingly, I think over the last couple of years, you've had a lot of, your good old veterans of the ANC lamenting the fact that the ANC has really gone astray. In other words, what were its founding values and the things that brought its faithful together. One of them was actually, non-racialism. But take a listen to how Cyril Ramaphosa himself put it.
Economic transformation requires an economy that is growing and creating employment. It requires an economy in which new businesses are able to emerge and flourish, where black people, the women of South Africa, are able to advance at all levels and in all areas of the economy, and where township and rural economies are able to grow. It is an economy in which the features of apartheid, inequality, and exclusion are steadily removed and replaced by an economy that involves, empowers, and benefits all South Africans. In the 28 years since the advent of democracy, the country's economy has grown, it has created employment and provided opportunities to the black people in our country and to women that they were previously denied.
Apologies for that wrong clip again. Well, but I mean, the issue that really he went to was the need for the ANC to go back to the values that it was meant to champion, and non-racialism is among those. But currently, you have a country that is increasingly polarized. And you have an ANC that's sitting by and watching this happen.
Yes, indeed. There's so much space for introspective thoughts there. And where has the ANC really dropped this ball for sustained, fast-paced, definitive transformation? There are changes, like Cyril Ramaphosa outlines there, many of them, and yet racism is so rife in our society, and the race-class convergence is very, very painful for many, if not obviously the bulk are South Africans. And that is where so many South Africans and young people feel that lack of definitive transformation, and that affects lives, and that makes people bitter. That even turns them populist when it comes to the system that has been condoning and further entrenching many aspects of racism. So I really think South Africa and South Africans and South African government and ANC government need to sit back and take serious action, systematic programs as to how to further and systematically eradicate racism, both interpersonal, on the human level, and on the structural, slightly more distance level.
But the question I think is whether the party that calls itself the leader of society is actually taking leadership on this very question.
Well, the problem is, and here, if we're going to go back, again, ugly and unpleasant history to face, the Black consciousness movement of the 1970s predicted this. Steve Biko, in his work in Frank Talk, the column said, if you simply change the color of the faces of the people who run the society, but you run it as of yesterday, what you'll see is a few black people get up to the top in economic terms, but the processes and systems will run as they do. And then the mass democratic movement of the United Democratic Front changed in the wake of the Black consciousness movement how we spoke about race in this country. And then all of those Rivonia trialists were released after 27 years in prison, and they used the terms of the 1950s in their political speeches in the early 90s. And so in 1994, we returned to non-racialism, as if a whole generation of scholarship, scientific and philosophical inquiry hasn't moved us to anti-racism. And now when the ANC says we need to go back and revisit, you want to go back to what? Go back to this non-racialism stance from the 1950s. And this is a discussion and a debate that I think very many people in the ANC, particularly older people, are invested in, because they understood the world in these terms of non-racialism, and they don't understand anti-racism. They haven't engaged with the scholarship and the philosophy through the 1980s that placed South African racism not as Derrida warned us, the last word in racism, but actually part of a global construction of difference and inequality in the global South. And so you're not just going to undo racism by imagining a society in which race doesn't matter. This is a society in which race does matter. It has material consequences, as Susan pointed out, for young people's life chances. So what you have to do is have deliberate anti-racist programming in your schools, in your education system, in your cultural system. You need to denazify the society and learn from the German failure of denazification, so that you do not sit 20 years from your denazification with the crises we sit with. Young people disaffected by the inability of the state to meet their needs and to undo the consequences of racism, not just in the interpersonal interactions of attitudes, as you point out, but in the structured systems of knowledge systems, of teaching, of education, in higher education, of the research done, and of the value placed on human beings and their life chances. Because if this insurrection of July 2021 started affecting the suburbs where the wealthy lived and where white people lived, the response may have been very, very different by the state. But because it was happening in rural and poor areas, in townships on the peripheries of our society, often that didn't happen. Think of the way in which the Defence Force dealt during the pandemic, with the man who was beaten to death in his own yard in Alexandra, for which no one is held accountable. Think of the Komapis. No middle-class white family has to collect their child from school with no accountability and no one being held responsible. Compare what happened to children who died under school camps for suburban schools and what happens to the Komapi family. And that, I think, is the blight in our society the ANC has to pay attention to and take grave responsibility for, because again, this society was not made only by the people in apartheid and colonial South Africa. It's a generation since the African National Congress took power and didn't take the lessons of the 1970s and 1980s that didn't happen to the ANC in exile, that happened in the mass democratic movement, the United Democratic Front, the Black consciousness movement, and in global scholarship and philosophy. And that, I think, is difficult work for a party to undertake when it's dealing with internal divisions and doesn't have a strong contemporary current intellectual tradition.
Of course, I mean, if the ANC does really make some serious inroads in interrogating these questions and taking them forward, as you say, Angelo, remains to be seen. We'll be here over the next 4 days, and at the end of it all, we'll be asking those questions. But I think we'll be too focused on who becomes the ANC's new leaders, something that was supposed to start, I mean, the voting was supposed to start happening in terms of the program tomorrow morning. That doesn't look like that's going to happen because they are running seriously late. But just from Cyril Ramaphosa's speech, Prof, were you able to discern any fighting spirit and a sense of sort of taking the war, so to speak, to his adversaries?
There are a few
Did any of that come through?
A few places in which he is here and there, and you showed a few clips where it also comes through. That's a little bit of almost aggression, certainly call it assertiveness coming through. And yes, one can certainly interpret that as a fighting spirit. But generally, he tends to take the laid-back position and almost let the system and those surrounding him, the supporters, let them fight the battle. And I'm reminded here of the argument when he just came to power that Cyril plays the long game. And in one of my books, I argue that it turns out it's rather a weak game. And the situation we sit now with the ANC is evidence that it is really a weak game. He has not stepped up sufficiently. He's already had 5 good years of making a definitive impact, and it's much more centered around peacemaking and creating this fictional unity of the ANC. ANC needs this kind of unity it has now. By being factional in this way and appealing to different constituencies, they actually bring in different constituencies into that ANC. So in many ways they need that. But yes, there's a little bit of fighting spirit, but I think overall his approach is, I sit back, let the other people who depend on me, the president, for their jobs and their positions and will therefore do the fighting, let them get on with it.
From where you sit,
Well, I suspect that many who are behind Cyril Ramaphosa would like to think of him as the iron fist inside the velvet glove. And my question is it an iron fist or is it an aluminium fist? Because he's also so easily bruised by precisely the disarray in the party that could see him lose the position by Tuesday.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks to both of you for this conversation, Angela Hick and, of course, Professor Susan Boyce. And that's it from the Watchdog team here at NASREC. Up next is our sister program, The Globe, and you may just see me there as well in the next few minutes before we stand down. For now, though, it's back to studio.